Picture this. It is late May 1718, and you are crouched behind a cannon on the main deck of a fat English merchant sloop somewhere off the coast of Charlestown, South Carolina. You have a flintlock pistol. You have a cutlass. You have been told the approaching vessel is a pirate, but nothing prepares you for what comes next. The ship bearing down on you flies no national colours. Instead, a black flag snaps from her foremast. A horned skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear in the other, stabbing a bleeding heart. And at the helm stands a figure who looks less like a man and more like something conjured from a fever dream. A towering shape wreathed in smoke, with ribbons of slow-burning fuse cord woven into his enormous black beard, each one lit, each one trailing thin wisps of sulphurous smoke around his face. His eyes glint through the haze. He carries 6 pistols strapped across his chest in a bandolier of silk sashes, and as you watch, his crew begins hurling things onto your deck. Not cannonballs, not grape shot, but clay pots that shatter on impact, releasing clouds of choking, stinking, blinding smoke that burns your throat and makes your eyes stream tears. You cannot see, you cannot breathe, and somewhere in that yellow fog, the boarding party is already climbing your rails. That man was Edward Teach, Blackbeard, and those clay pots were Stinkpots, improvised chemical grenades filled with brimstone, rotten fish, wet leather, and whatever else the crew could find that would produce the most suffocating, nauseating smoke imaginable. Welcome to the real arsenal of the Golden Age pirate, a world where gunpowder was just the beginning, and the strangest weapons were often the most effective. This is not Hollywood. This is history, and it is far, far weirder than anything a screenwriter ever invented. To understand why pirates invented such bizarre weapons, you have to understand one fundamental truth about piracy in the Golden Age, roughly 1690 to 1730. Pirates were not navies. They did not have supply chains. They did not have arsenals. They did not have government contracts with foundries in Birmingham or Toulon. Every single weapon a pirate crew carried was either stolen, scavenged, improvised, or bought on the black market at exorbitant prices in places like Nassau, Port Royal, or Madagascar. After the Treaty of Utrecht ended the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713, thousands of experienced privateer sailors found themselves unemployed. Men who had spent years fighting the French and Spanish under letters of marque were suddenly cast adrift, skilled in combat, trained in seamanship, and broke. Many turned pirate. But when they did, they discovered a problem. The weapons they had used as privateersmen belonged to the Crown. The cannons, the powder stores, the shot, all of it stayed with the decommissioned ships or was sold off. So the first generation of Golden Age pirates, men like Benjamin Hornigold, Henry Jennings, Charles Vane, and eventually Blackbeard himself, had to build their arsenals from scratch, and they did it the only way they could, by stealing what they needed and inventing the rest. This created an arms economy unlike anything in conventional naval warfare. A Royal Navy 5th rate carried standardised 9-pound and 6-pound guns, uniform powder charges, and regulation small arms. A pirate ship carried whatever it had managed to accumulate: mismatched cannons of different calibers, muskets from 3 different nations, pistols that might or might not fire, and a bewildering collection of improvised ordnance that no navy would have recognised. But here is the crucial insight, the one that makes this story about ingenuity rather than desperation alone. Pirates did not want to destroy the ships they attacked. A sunken merchant vessel was worthless. A burned prize was a total loss. What pirates wanted was surrender. Fast, bloodless, and complete. The ideal pirate engagement ended with the merchant crew throwing up their hands before a single cannon was fired. And that meant the most valuable weapon in a pirate's arsenal was not destructive power. It was terror. Let us meet the engineers. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was the undisputed master of theatrical intimidation. Operating primarily out of North Carolina between 1716 and 1718, Teach understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. The battle was won or lost in the minutes before contact. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship called La Concorde, a 200-ton frigate mounting roughly 40 guns after Teach's modifications, was itself a weapon of psychological warfare. Teach armed her far beyond what her tonnage warranted, not because he needed the firepower, but because a merchant captain counting gun ports through a spyglass would see a warship and think twice. The slow-burning hemp fuses braided into Teach's beard are documented in Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, admittedly a legend-layer source, but one that drew on contemporary accounts. Johnson describes Teach going into battle with lighted matches under his hat, which appearing on each side of his face, his eyes naturally looking fierce and wild, made him altogether such a figure that imagination cannot form an idea of a fury from hell to look more frightful. Whether the detail is embellished or literal, the tactical logic is sound. A man wreathed in smoke, with lit fuses crackling around his face, is not someone you want to fight. Then there were the Stinkpots, arguably the single most creative weapon in the pirate arsenal. These were ceramic or glass containers filled with a mixture of sulfur, saltpeter, ground-up decayed fish, asafoetida, a resin with a smell often compared to rotting garlic, and wet animal hides. When ignited and thrown onto an enemy deck, they produced a cloud of smoke so foul that it could incapacitate a crew faster than grape shot. The principle was not new. Incendiary pots had been used in Chinese naval warfare centuries earlier, and Mediterranean corsairs had employed similar devices. But Caribbean pirates refined the concept into a standardized boarding weapon. Archaeological evidence supports this. The excavation of the Queen Anne's Revenge wreck site off Beaufort, North Carolina, discovered in 1996 and systematically excavated from 1997 onward by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, has yielded fragments of ceramic grenades, glass bottle grenades, and what appear to be the remains of incendiary devices consistent with stinkpot construction. The wreck also produced an extraordinary volume of small arms, blunderbusses, pistols, and dozens of lead shot of varying calibers, evidence of an armory designed for close-quarters boarding rather than long-range naval gunnery. Beyond Blackbeard, other pirates contributed their own innovations. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, who captured over 400 ships between 1719 and 1722, was known for using fireships, old, expendable vessels loaded with combustibles and sailed directly into an enemy fleet. At Wider Harbour in January 1722, Roberts burned the slave ship Porcupine as a warning to the other 11 captains in port. The message was clear: surrender your cargo or watch your ship become fuel. Samuel Bellamy's crew aboard the Wider galley, which sank off Cape Cod in April 1717 and was discovered by Barry Clifford in 1984, carried an arsenal that included grenades made from wine bottles filled with gunpowder and musket balls, sealed with tar and fitted with fuses. These were essentially 18th century fragmentation grenades, crude, unreliable, and devastatingly effective at close range. And then there was the boarding arsenal itself. Cutlasses were standard, short, heavy, single-edged swords designed for hacking in confined spaces, where a longer blade would catch on rigging. But pirates also carried marlin spikes, heavy iron spikes normally used for splicing rope, as stabbing weapons, belaying pins pulled from the rails as clubs, and boarding axes that served double duty as tools and weapons. Some crews carried caltrops, four-pointed iron spikes scattered on an enemy deck to slow barefoot sailors. The Admiralty trial records from the mass prosecution of Roberts' crew at Cape Coast Castle in April 1722 describe captured pirates carrying diverse weapons of unusual and cruel design, though the records frustratingly do not itemize them further. Now let us see how all of this worked in practice, because the genius of pirate weaponry was not in any single device. It was in the choreography. A typical Golden Age pirate attack was a performance, staged as carefully as any piece of theatre, and it followed a recognizable script. Act 1, The approach. The pirate vessel would close on her target flying false colours, a French flag, a Spanish pennant, a Dutch ensign, whatever matched the waters they were sailing. This was not cowardice. It was standard practice in an era when visual identification was the only identification. Even Royal Navy warships sometimes flew false colours as a tactical deception. The pirate would close to hailing distance, perhaps 200 yards, before showing her true face. Act 2. The reveal. At a signal from the captain, the false colours came down and the black flag went up. Simultaneously, the gun ports opened. If the pirate ship had been disguised as a merchantman, tarps over her gun ports reduced sail to look slower. The disguise dropped at the same moment. In seconds, a harmless-looking trader transformed into a bristling warship. This moment was designed to produce shock. The psychological transition from "that ship is friendly" to "that ship is going to kill me" was meant to paralyze decision-making. Act 3. The warning shot. A single cannon fired across the merchant's bow. This was the universal signal: surrender now, and no one dies. Resist, and what follows is on you. Most merchant captains, underpaid, underarmed, and sailing ships owned by someone else, struck their colours at this point. Contemporary estimates suggest that as many as 80 to 90% of pirate engagements ended without significant fighting. The theatre worked. But when it did not work, when the merchant was armed or brave or carrying cargo too valuable to surrender, the performance escalated. Act 4. The barrage. Not a conventional broadside aimed at sinking the target. Instead, pirates loaded their guns with what was called langrage: scrap iron, nails, broken glass, chain links, anything jagged and sharp, packed over a powder charge. Langrage turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. It shredded sails and rigging, cut standing lines, and swept the enemy deck with a storm of metal fragments without holing the hull below the waterline. The goal was not to sink, but to dismast and demoralize. Swivel guns mounted on the rails, small, fast-loading cannons on pivot mounts, were loaded with the same material and aimed directly at the enemy crew. Alongside the langrage came the grenades, stinkpots arcing through the air trailing smoke, glass bottle grenades packed with powder and shot, firepots, ceramic vessels filled with a mixture of pitch, sulfur, and gunpowder that ignited on impact and stuck to whatever they hit, burning with a flame that seawater could not easily extinguish. The combination was calculated. The stinkpots blinded and choked. The firepots created panic about fire, the single greatest fear on any wooden ship. And the fragmentation grenades killed or wounded anyone still standing in the open. Act 5. The board. With the enemy's deck obscured by smoke, her rigging cut, her crew gagging and half-blind, the pirates crossed. Grappling hooks, heavy iron hooks on ropes, locked the two ships together. Boarding planks bridged the gap, and over the rails came men armed for close-quarters butchery. Cutlasses, pistols fired at point-blank range and then used as clubs, boarding axes, marlin spikes. Some accounts describe pirates throwing handfuls of sand, ground glass, or quicklime, powdered lime, into the faces of defenders, a tactic borrowed from Mediterranean corsairs that could cause temporary or permanent blindness. The entire sequence, from false colours to boarding, might take 15 minutes. And every element of it was designed not to destroy but to overwhelm, to make resistance feel not just dangerous but pointless, to create the impression that fighting back against these men, these smoke-wreathed, screaming, grenade-hurling madmen, was an act of suicide rather than courage. That is what made pirate weaponry so remarkable. It was not advanced. It was not sophisticated. It was theatre. Brutal, terrifying, and astonishingly effective theatre. But how much of this is documented fact, and how much is legend that has calcified into accepted history? The honest answer is both, tangled together. Our primary narrative source for Golden Age piracy remains Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, first published in London in 1724. Johnson, whose real identity is still debated, the attribution to Daniel Defoe has been largely discredited by modern scholars, was writing within living memory of the events he described, and some of his accounts clearly drew on trial records, depositions, and newspaper reports. But Johnson was also writing to sell books. He had every incentive to make pirates more colourful, more terrifying, and more dramatic than they actually were. The Stinkpots are a good example. Johnson mentions incendiary devices being used in boarding actions, and the archaeological evidence from the Queen Anne's Revenge confirms that some form of grenade or incendiary weapon was carried aboard pirate vessels. But the specific recipes, the rotting fish, the asafoetida, the wet leather, come from later compilations and may reflect a blending of Caribbean pirate practice with much older Mediterranean and Asian naval traditions. We know pirates used smoke weapons. We are less certain about exactly what went into them. Similarly, Blackbeard's lit fuses are famous but thinly sourced. Johnson describes them vividly, and the image has become iconic. But no surviving deposition from a victim of Blackbeard's attacks mentions the fuses specifically. They may have been real. Theatrical intimidation was clearly part of Teach's method. Or they may have been Johnson's embellishment of a general reputation for ferocity. What the documentary record does confirm, beyond reasonable doubt, is the tactical framework, the false colours, the black flag, the warning shot, the escalation from intimidation to violence. These are attested in dozens of Admiralty trial depositions, victim statements, and governor's correspondence held in the British National Archives and the Colonial Office papers. The pattern is consistent across different pirate crews operating in different waters over a span of decades. The archaeological record adds physical confirmation. The Queen Anne's Revenge excavation has produced over 400,000 artefacts as of 2023, including cannon, small arms, grenades, and edged weapons. The wider galley excavation, the only confirmed pirate shipwreck from the Golden Age, has yielded similar material, including the wine bottle grenades and a massive arsenal of pistols and muskets. These are not legends. These are objects you can see in a museum. So the picture that emerges is this. The broad strokes are real. Pirates absolutely used improvised chemical weapons, fragmentation grenades, incendiary devices, and a systematic program of psychological warfare. The specific details, who invented what, exactly which ingredients went into the stinkpots, whether Blackbeard really lit his beard on fire, are murkier, filtered through sources that mixed reporting with storytelling. What is not in doubt is the ingenuity. These were men operating outside every supply chain, every arsenal, every institution, and they built a weapon system that terrorized the Atlantic for a generation. It is worth noting how thoroughly Hollywood has both borrowed from and sanitized this history. The Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, which has grossed over $4.5 billion worldwide, builds its entire visual language on the theatrical pirate. Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow is, at his core, a descendant of the Blackbeard strategy. Be so strange, so unpredictable, so visually disorienting that your enemies hesitate just long enough for you to win. The smoke, the coal-rimmed eyes, the erratic behavior. It is the slow-burning fuse translated into comedy. But the films strip out the ugly mechanics. There are no stinkpots in Pirates of the Caribbean. No one throws quicklime. No one scatters caltrops on a deck where men fight barefoot. The grenades are absent. The langrage is absent. The entire chemical warfare dimension of real pirate combat, the part that made it genuinely terrifying rather than swashbuckling, is erased. Even the more serious portrayals, the 2022-2023 television series Our Flag Means Death, which depicted Blackbeard instead of Bonnet, play the weapons for comedy or omit them entirely. The stinkpot, arguably the most innovative weapon of the Golden Age, has never appeared in a major film or television production. What the screen versions keep is the flag, and that is appropriate, because the flag was itself a weapon. The Jolly Roger, in its dozens of variations, was a standardized threat display. A red flag, sometimes called the Bloody Banner, or Jolie Rouge, which may be the etymological origin of Jolly Roger, meant no quarter. Surrender now or everyone dies. A black flag meant quarter would be given if you surrendered immediately. The flag communicated a specific tactical message. The level of violence you could expect was calibrated to how quickly you complied. That is psychological warfare at its purest, and it cost nothing to produce: a piece of black cloth and some paint. The cheapest and most effective weapon in the entire pirate arsenal. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that the Golden Age pirate was, among other things, an engineer, a problem solver operating under extreme constraints, with no institutional support, no research budget, and no margin for error. Every weapon described in this video was born from a specific tactical need and built from whatever materials were at hand. Sulfur from volcanic islands, saltpeter scraped from cave walls, broken glass from rum bottles, scrap iron from captured cargo, rotten fish from the bilge. There is something almost admirable in that. A brutal kind of creativity that refuses to accept the limitations of its circumstances. These men could not outgun the Royal Navy. They could not outspend the East India Company. So they outthought them. They turned chemistry, psychology, and sheer theatrical audacity into a weapon system that held the Atlantic hostage for decades. But admiration should not become romance. These weapons were used on real people. The stinkpot that blinds and chokes was thrown at merchant sailors earning subsistence wages. The langrage that shreds rigging also shreds flesh. The caltrops that slow a defender are driven into the bare soul of a man who cannot afford shoes. The ingenuity was real, but so was the suffering it produced. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember about the golden age of piracy, and about the strange, creative, horrifying weapons its practitioners invented. Every one of these devices was a solution to a problem. And the problem was this: how do you make another human being so afraid that he stops fighting? The answer, it turned out, was gunpowder and sand. If this video changed the way you think about pirate warfare, hit subscribe, because next time we are going inside the ship itself, into the world of pirate food and the horrifying reality of what these men actually ate at sea. Weevil-infested hardtack, rancid salt pork, and a mysterious stew called salmagundi that might be the most disgusting recipe in maritime history. You do not want to miss it. Hit the bell, drop a comment telling me which weapon surprised you the most, and I will see you on the next voyage.